thank you very much for joining tonight, everyone. So this is the second of our training sessions about the reviews and the different review opportunities that you can get involved with the Research Support Service. We'll start, so tonight we're going to be looking, as we've mentioned, we're going to be looking at the Public Involvement and Engagement Resource, or the PIER, and the reviews that you can do of that, of the applications to that fund, and I'll come in a second to what that fund is. And the second type of review that we'll focus on tonight is the Plain English Summary reviews, or the PES reviews. This, of course, builds on the last session where we were talking about meeting with researchers. So virtual meetings with researchers where you spend an hour with them and you chat through various parts of their research design and you share your views with them on that. So these are two quite different types of review that we're talking about tonight. They don't involve that kind of conversation with the researcher in the same way, but we have some tips that we'd like to share with you tonight. As with the last session, what we're not doing tonight is kind of telling you what you should be saying. Obviously, we have absolutely no interest in telling you kind of what you should be saying for these reviews. That's entirely up to you. Your views are your own. All we're looking to do with this training is give you a bit more information about these reviews so that hopefully you feel comfortable and confident sharing whatever views you have on what the researcher has written when they're writing the Plain English Summary or the application to this fund, the PIER application, which I'll come to in a second. So yeah, as with the last one, there's no kind of we're definitely not guiding you on what to say. It's just hopefully giving you a bit more information about the context of these reviews. So I'll start by talking about the PIER, and then Zoe will come in and tell you a bit more about the Plain English Summaries. So the PIER, Public Involvement and Engagement Resource, another acronym, I'm afraid. But yes, if I mention the PIER from now on, that's what that one means. This is a fund, and it's worth keeping in mind that researchers, and we mentioned this at the last session, but just in case you couldn't make that one, researchers who are coming to the Research Support Service for help, they're usually at quite an early stage in putting together a research funding application. They're not at the point where they've got the funding to do the work and then they're looking for support on how to kind of deliver a project. They're at that early stage where they're bringing together their ideas, they're putting together a team, they're designing, they're trying to work out what research methods are best, and they're talking to patients and the public at that early stage when they're actually putting together the funding application. But of course, obviously that means that they don't actually have the funding at that point. So we're saying to them, you really need to be involving patients and members of the public, carers, service users when you're designing that funding application. And we're saying to them that it's good practice to pay people for their time to do that. But of course, at this stage, they don't actually have the funding that they're trying to get. So there's a gap there. And that's where this fund comes in. So we have set aside a pot of money that people can apply to for that early patient and public involvement. So the patient and public involvement before they actually get their main grant funding. Because then, of course, patient and public involvement is important throughout. Hopefully they get funded and hopefully they get to do the exciting project that they're planning to do. And obviously they'll be involving patients and the public throughout that. But we're talking about the pre-kind of application stage. This is what this fund is for. It's up to £350. So each researcher can apply for each project can apply for up to £350. So we're not talking huge sums here. It is we recognise that there is some limits to what you can do with £350. But many of the researchers that we're working with, they potentially have other ways of building on funding on top of this. So there might be other pots that other organisations are offering that they can apply for. There are other things that they can think about doing. They might think about how can they offer remuneration that's not financial as well. So what kind of time could they, if they're wanting to build some work with a community group, can they put in some of their time into that to try and kind of build relationships as well as the financial remuneration? So it's up to that £350. We have a sort of clause that they must be at least 8 weeks away from submitting their main funding application. and ideally a bit longer than that, ideally more like 12 weeks. We're not in the we it's not in our interests to fund this when they are only 3 or 4 weeks away from submitting the main funding application, because we don't think that leaves long enough to do meaningful involvement. It leaves long enough to kind of meet with a group and do a bit of kind of tick box. I've met with a group and they said everything was fine in my application, but that's not what we're interested in doing. That's not what we're interested in funding. So we really want people to be doing involvement meaningfully and to actually be making changes to the main funding application based on the public involvement that they do at this stage. So that's why we put that limit of they must be at least 8 weeks away from submitting their main funding application. So the fund itself, and I'm just giving you a bit of info about the fund first, and then I'll come to what could be your role in reviewing applications to it. What can they do with the fund? Again, we have a few kind of rules on what they can do with it and what they can't do with that £350. They can, and they often do, use it to pay members of the public for their time. So if they're going out and they're meeting with a community group or a patient group, or they're doing one-to-one meetings with several individuals, they could use this fund to, for example, pay people for their time or offer them vouchers for their time as a thank you for the time and the expertise that people are bringing to the table there. That is one of the most common things that people use this fund for, and that's often what they don't have other money to do. Often researchers will say, well, I've got access to maybe a community venue where people are meeting anyway, and they've got they can pay for some resources, they can kind of print things at the university or wherever they work, but they don't have that funding to pay people for their time. So that's one of the most common uses of this fund. They can also use it to reimburse people's travel expenses, the public contributors' travel expenses. So if they were asking people to come and meet them at a church hall somewhere, let's say, they could pay for people's travel to do that. They can pay to hire a venue if that's justified. It often is justified because we think that these meetings shouldn't necessarily be taking place at a university or at a hospital if that's not what people want. So it often is justified to hire somewhere to have those meetings. Payment of costs to facilitate involvement. So it might be that they're working with a community group, and the community group say, and we've done this quite a lot in the past, where we pay the community group for their time to set up that meeting and to actually host it and to kind of advertise it to members of their group, for example. That's all their time that's taken away from their core business of whatever that community group does or that support group. So it's only right that we offer some money to help cover that as well. So that can be covered within this. It can also pay for materials that the researcher wouldn't normally have access to. So we don't offer things like printing. If they work at a university or a hospital, they generally can access that kind of thing. But if let's say they want to do some work with a group of young people and they think that they need some resources to do like a creative session with them, they want to do some zine making, or we've had loads of different creative things that people have applied to do in the past. They could use this fund to cover those kind of materials. What can they not do with it? It can't pay for time or expenses of the research team. That is kind of covered as part of their core contracts that they're on anyway. So we wouldn't be paying for their time or their travel expenses as part of that. That should be covered. And travel expenses, they should be able to, as part of whatever institution they're working for, they should be able to cover that as part of their core contract that they're on. We can't pay for the time of paid members of staff to develop the research. So similar to that, they can't kind of say, oh, I'm going to get a research nurse on board to run this session for me, and I need to pay them for their time, because if it's someone that they're getting on board, that'll again be covered as part of their contracted work. It can't be paid to undertake research. So this is for public involvement and engagement. It's not for setting up interviews with people where the researcher would be collecting data. That's a different thing altogether, as I'm sure you're all aware of, which we covered in the last session. That's not involvement, that's participation. So this fund is specifically for patient and public involvement. It wouldn't be for covering the costs of actually undertaking research. This is about listening to people's views and having them as a critical friend to help you design the research, not to actually take part in it. We wouldn't use it to pay to hire a venue within someone's own organisation. That's not a good use of the fund. And we wouldn't offer them payment for materials which they could reasonably gain access to, so printing and that kind of thing, any kind of stationery, those kind of things that should be reasonably covered within their work that they do anyway. So that's what the public involvement and engagement resource is, and your role in it, which is what we're kind of specifically here to talk about tonight, is to review applications to that fund. So these are one of the regular involvement opportunities that you'll see on our newsletter. You'll see a PIER application review. And this is it's a short application form that people fill in. They fill it in online. It's a Microsoft form. We download the response and we send it out to people who are interested in reviewing that. The thinking here is that we shouldn't be, as the kind of research support service staff, we shouldn't be the only ones saying, yes, that's a good application, or no, it's not. We really want your views on whether it's a good, valid application, and whether you think they can make improvements. So it's not we're not looking for a yes or no from you. I'll come to that in a second. But whether they can make improvements. So this is about feedback to them as well as just, yes, I think it's a strong application, or not. It's about improving it. So what's the purpose of doing that review? So as I've already covered, it's about supporting researchers to access that funding to bridge the gap between where they are and where they want to be with their involvement. But yeah, it's about providing feedback on those pre-application PPI activities. So by that, I mean what they're doing with patients and the public and the conversations that they're having to try and inform their main funding application, if you like, the research project application that they're working on. And it's about making sure that those activities, these pre-application ones, are relevant, they're appropriate, and they're properly budgeted. It's not about, so when you come to do one of these peer review applications, so you'll be sent the researcher's application. I'd encourage you, when you sit down to have a look at it, try to kind of get out of the mindset of analysing the language of that application and focus more on the activities. I say that with some caveats. Obviously, the language is important if you feel like they're really missing the point, or they're really not clear and you can't understand the application. That's then, I think, totally fine to feedback on the language there. If they're excluding anyone through their language, for example, that would be a good reason to raise language. But I say this because it's a bit of a contrast to what Zoe's going to tell you about afterwards. So the Plain English Summary review is very much about the language. So when you come to do one of those reviews, definitely think very carefully about the language that's in front of you. But with these ones, it's a lot more, we're very interested in what you think about their proposed plan and the proposed activities, rather than just the language that they're using to describe it in the application. It's not about approving funding for the research. So like I say, this is very much about those pre-application involvement activities, and it's not about the actual funding application. So what you say and what you feedback will not kind of damage their chances of, let's say, for example, you thought it was quite a poor application and you wanted to say that, and that's absolutely, we'd totally encourage that. But you might feel like, oh, do I really want to be this critical in case it, because I do think it's valuable research and I want it to go ahead in the end. Please be critical, because it's not going to damage their overall funding application. If anything, it's going to strengthen it, because the better they can make these pre-application involvement activities, obviously once they speak to members of the public, and those members of the public help them to strengthen the final application, that's only going to make it better. So don't be kind of nervous about being critical in case it impacts further down the line. It'll actually strengthen it further down the line. It's not so much this review about sharing thoughts on the overall direction of the research. The application form doesn't capture in a lot of detail what that kind of overall, the overall detail about the project in a way that it would if you were coming to one of the meetings that we talked about last time, for example. Then you're sent an overview in advance and the researcher will present to you and tell you about kind of the overall direction of the research, and their plan for the whole project, hopefully, if they get funded. In this application form, it's a lot more focused on those pre-application involvement activities, and there's not so much about that. There is a bit, because obviously that is important context, but this review is way more about those critiquing those involvement activities rather than the kind of overall direction of the research. So 3 key things to consider when you, let's say you put yourself forward to do one of these reviews, and you get the application form. 3 key things, and our feedback form that we send to you does actually prompt you to think through these 3 things. It's divided into headings, so you will be prompted, like I say, to think about these 3 things. The first is the activities, the second is the budget, and the third is anything else. So looking first of all at the activities. So within that broad heading of kind of what do you think about these activities, I would encourage you to think about these questions. So is the purpose for the PPI, so the involvement, is it clear why they're involving patients and members of the public? And do they have a clear sort of plan of what value that's going to bring to the research? Are the involvement activities appropriate? And that's quite a big open question, and I'd encourage you to use your interpretation there of whether they're appropriate. Do you feel like, I guess within that, the kind of things you might want to think about is, are they doing enough? If they are saying they're only going to talk to 1 or 2 people, maybe you'd feel like that wasn't enough. If they're trying to talk to 100 people, maybe you'd feel like that was, they're trying to stretch themselves too thin and doing too much. Are the proposed plans, do you feel like it's something people would get on board with? So if they're saying, I don't know, just as an example, if they're going to be they want to talk to parents, let's say, and they are deciding only to talk to mothers or only to fathers, you might see that as, okay, maybe there's a role for bringing in both parents there. Or they might say, we're going to be meeting with people at this venue, and this is going to be the kind of proposed time of day we're going to do it. And you might think, actually, you're not going to get anyone to actually do that because your target group, maybe they're a group who are normally at work during those times or normally have caring responsibilities during those times. So it's kind of thinking through the plan that they've suggested. Do you feel like it's feasible? Do you feel like it's doable? Do you see any barriers there that they might have missed? Thinking through as well, is it clear which aspects of research design the public will contribute to? So there's a part of the application form that asks them to highlight whether, where do they see the public making a difference in this research? Is it on the research question? Is it on, are they going to ask them about their methods? And do they expect the public to have some impact there? Are they going to ask about recruitment further down the line, when they're recruiting people to actually take part in their research? Is that what they're going to use some of this time to talk about? And we do kind of encourage people to be quite clear about that, because if they try and cover, we're conscious that this is a limit of £350 and it has to be quite focused discussion. They don't have all the time in the world to kind of go and do 10 sessions with a group or something like that. So we encourage them to kind of narrow down, the researcher to narrow down in their own mind, what aspects of the research design am I going to ask the public to contribute to here? So when you're reviewing that, just see whether that kind of comes through. Thinking through the budget, so things to think about. I want to reassure you here that don't worry about kind of missing anything here and someone using budget inappropriately. We also look at these, so it's not like if someone suggests something wildly inappropriate with the budget, we would be catching that as well. So it's not on your shoulders. I don't want anyone to feel like, what if I, miss something with the budget and they are misspending this funding? We'll also be looking at these, so don't feel like that's solely on your shoulders. When you're looking at the budget, it's more thinking through, do you feel like it's appropriate? And again, it's a big word, but your interpretation of appropriate, we're really interested in just what you think. Is that a good use of the funding? Are there any costs they haven't included? That's a really key question, I think, to consider. It's sometimes quite easy to look at these quite short applications and think, okay, yeah, that all looks feasible, but I would definitely encourage you to think about what's missing as well, what maybe they haven't included. That's the hardest stuff to review because it's obviously not there. But in your review, I would encourage you to think about things that are missing as well as just feeding back on what they've written. For example, they might have planned a really, really nice sounding session at a community centre, but they haven't included any refreshment costs, or they haven't included any travel costs for people. So, that's the kind of feedback that you might want to give them on that. Are there any costs they shouldn't have included? Again, I've given you that rough overview of what they can't use this fund for, but we'd kind of take ultimate responsibility if someone applied for it and there was something that we felt wasn't appropriate. So don't feel like you have to take ultimate responsibility for that, but we are interested in your thoughts on what is kind of appropriate and not appropriate use of the budget. So anything else? That's specifically on the application form to catch the review form to capture anything else, because obviously those two, just looking at the activities in the budget, that is, I guess, quite we're guiding you quite strongly there in those two categories, but we're also interested, is there just anything else that catches you in this application? Is there anything where you're thinking, that doesn't sit easy with me, or I think they could really tweak this and it would make it stronger? So for example here, are the people and communities the research team intend to involve or engage? Are they sort of relevant to the study? Can you think of anyone else they've missed out? Are there steps to address the diversity of the public members and the inclusiveness of the PPI? And will the public members be supported appropriately? So this is something that I feel like people they often miss out, and we're trying to prompt the researchers more in our discussions with them to include this in their applications. But what will they be doing to not just the functional kind of where will the meeting be held or how will they contact people, but how will they support them and make sure that people make sure that they're engaging sensitively with people and appropriately with people. So if it's, for example, if it's going to be a really challenging topic to talk about, what are they going to do about that? Because they can't just rock up, talk to people for an hour and then leave them with absolutely no kind of, if the people are upset from having talked about a sensitive subject, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to just walk out the door and say, thank you very much, see you next time. So what are they going to be doing? What's their plan there to support people appropriately? It might be things like tech support as well. If it's an online meeting that they're proposing, there's lots of different ways they can support people to get involved. So have a think about that when you're reviewing these applications as well. So as an overview there, we've kind of included this slide specifically because we also have an overview of the Plain English summary at the end of that section. So when you come back to these slides, hopefully when you're doing those reviews, we're hoping this might be quite a nice overview for you to come back to and kind of contrast those two reviews. Okay, this is the overview of the PIER review in contrast to the overview of the Plain English summary review. So generally, is it clear and justified, the activity that they're doing? Are they appropriate? Is it clear which aspects of the research design they'll contribute to? Is the budget appropriate? And is there anything else? All those ways that we covered. Is there anything that they're missing here that you think would strengthen it as an application and strengthen the activities? And just as a reminder there, to focus on the content and the plan that they're actually proposing, not necessarily how it's written. We're not kind of as interested in typos or those kind of things as part of these applications. It's more about kind of the content of the plan that they're proposing. That's what we really want your feedback on. So that is in a nutshell the public involvement and engagement review opportunities. I'm going to hand over to Zoe, who's going to talk us through the Plain English summary reviews, and then we can come to any questions that you might have about either of those.
Thank you, Alex. So looking at sort of the plain English summary, so the NIHR, so the National Institute for Health and Care Research, who, many people are kind of applying to for funding for their research, as part of the application, everybody has to provide a plain English summary. So their definition of this is that it's a clear, brief summary of the research that's been written for members of the public rather than written for researchers or professionals. It needs to be written clearly, needs to be simple, without any jargon, and with an explanation of any technical terms. So essentially, it needs to be a summary of what their research is and what they're going to be doing, explained in a way that the average person, layperson, can understand it and will understand it, and making sure it's simple, it's easy to follow. There's not loads of acronyms in there that aren't explained. There's not loads of scientific terms that are in there that's not explained. It needs to be sort of simple and straightforward, and written for the sort of layperson on the street. Next slide, please, Alex. This is where the technical difficulties come in. So what is the purpose of a plain English summary review? It's about giving detailed feedback on the summary that the researcher provides you. So when we kind of send out the plain English summary, it's about giving back written, detailed feedback on, your thoughts and feedback about it. It's about providing that feedback about how it's written. So when Alex was talking about the peer review and saying about it's not about sort of focusing on what it's saying and how it's written, that's because this is what sort of the plain English summary is about. It's about how it's written to make sure that it's accessible for public members and accessible for people that aren't specialist in that area of research. The plain English summary review, it's not about telling them how to improve their plan or kind of pointing out flaws about what they're planning. It's not about approving them for funding for their research. It's not about kind of testing your knowledge or the researcher's knowledge about their area of research either. The whole idea of the review of the summary is to provide that really sort of detailed feedback about how accessible it is for the average person. Can you see, is it understandable? Have they used those acronyms that, they've not explained what they are, that they're, you're confused about something, and kind of making sure that it's going to be something that somebody could pick up in a magazine and read and understand what this research is going to be about. And it's kind of helping them tailor that so that it's going to be something that's accessible to everybody. So what we're going to have a little look at, and that is a lovely animation flaw of mine apparently, we're going to have a little look at some tips for the what you can sort of expect from yourself for the plain English summary and what to do. So kind of when you're providing feedback, it's about kind of looking at the style of the summary. It's about, can you understand it? Or is there parts of it that it's not clear what they're saying, what they're talking about, what they're trying to achieve, or what they're kind of trying to convey? Tell the researcher, just tell them that you're not sure what they mean in this section or this sentence, and that it needs a bit more clarity, because if you don't understand it, somebody else probably won't understand it as well. It's about spotting, if there's acronyms that they've used that they've not explained or you don't really understand, about pointing those out. Or if the whole thing, you read it and you really don't know what they're trying to answer, what they're trying to explain, it's about pointing that out and kind of sharing those feedback. Don't worry when you're providing your sort of feedback and your comments about thinking that it's a really obvious comment or, something that going to sound silly or something like that. It's not any, that's nothing to worry about. It is about pointing those out because you're kind of removed from that, from the research, and because you have that impartial, let's say, sort of perspective on it. Those things that you think might be really obvious is probably something that they've completely overlooked because they're so in the middle of that research and that's all they're thinking about. That's when you do overlook those sort of obvious things, and it takes having somebody that's kind of a little bit removed from the research, a little bit outside, saying, you've made a mistake here, or this bit isn't clear, or we don't really understand this bit, for them to suddenly look at it with a fresh pair of eyes to go, oh, yes, of course, like, you know, I've completely forgotten that I've not explained this term, because they're so involved in that language and that's their day-to-day that they might assume that it's, you know, what everybody is used to, but actually it's not the case. In your sort of feedback that you provide, it's really good if you can kind of be clear, concise, and confident in your review. So what we mean by that is, don't feel that you need to apologise for pointing something out that you think is wrong or that they've made a mistake. That's what you're there for. That is kind of why they've come to you. This is what they want, is that they want your perspective, they want your feedback, and they want you to kind of point out, say, those errors or those sort of mistakes that they might have made. But if you're apologetic about it, it kind of takes away maybe the seriousness or the importance of the point that you're making, because it's kind of adding that tone of, you know, it's kind of like a sort of unsure point. But if you're kind of confident in what your feedback you're saying, what that, you know, you've identified this sort of mistake or something that they need to improve, then that kind of provides a little extra oomph into your feedback and supports kind of what you're saying. So along that line as well is sort of the idea of, yes, you're providing that feedback and be confident in that approach, absolutely. But sometimes, you know, it's just about being that respectful sort of feedback, kind of something that you would be happy saying to their face and kind of comfortable saying face to face. I think we're all kind of, you know, sometimes I think we all forget, sometimes written feedback, it's a lot harder to get sort of tone and message across. So it's kind of being a bit conscious about what it is that you are saying. That's not to say you can't, you know, say what your thoughts are, what your feedback is about how they can improve it. It's just being a bit considerate about what it is exactly you're saying and making sure it's something that you'd be comfortable saying to their face. A lot of them might be, you know, very experienced researchers. They can take criticism and sort of that feedback, that critical feedback. Some of them might, you know, it might be very new to them, and it's something that's probably very close to them, and having, you know, that feedback, depending on what it is, can, you know, be a bit harsh sometimes, but that's not, you know, that is why you're there. You are that critical friend, but it's just about sort of being respectful of the comments as well. If you've got any sort of thoughts and comments that you want to put, and you've got something, a way that they can improve it, and you think you have those ideas or those examples, give them. Absolutely sort of welcomed. It's an added thing for them, to the researchers, to be able to think about. You know, your opinion of how that research can be improved is really vital for that researcher. It's really good feedback for them to be able to help them develop that application. And at the end of the day, that's what you're there for, is to kind of help them shape that research so that it is going to be, you know, designed for you and for the communities, and it's going to have that impact, that, you know, that most beneficial sort of impact. So if you think that, you know, there are other ways that they can share their results, then tell them, you know, this might be something to consider, or, you know, this might be a better route to go down when you're sharing the results. Or if you think that there might be a better way of sort of including somebody, you can also put that in these sort of comments as well. And then before you sort of send back your reply, have a little reread over it. Sometimes, you know, making sure that what you've written as well is, you know, that it's sort of understandable, that you know exactly what you're kind of saying, making sure that you've kind of covered all the points as well that you want to, making sure you've kind of getting that message across. And if you're unable to answer one of the questions, say so. So when we email you the Plain English Summary, we will, and I'll show you in the next slide, and make sure you've not waffled on and on. Well, waffling's absolutely fine, as long as you're conveying your comments and getting it across, absolutely. But when you get the Plain English Summary, we also provide you this information that's on the screen. So it kind of shows you the areas of what you should be looking at when you're looking at a Plain English Summary. So you're thinking about the key details. Does it cover the key areas? Is it in an order that's making sense? Does it include information on certain areas of their research project? And is there anything that needs to be moved around to make it a bit more coherent? Thinking about the language, how do you think they've used language properly? Is it simple? Is it easy to understand? Or is it complicated? Is it over the top? Did they waffle on and kind of not really get to the point? You know, kind of giving that feedback. Is there anything that they can improve to make it easy to follow, to make it concise, to make it understandable for the average person? And then thinking about sort of the research as well, the proposed research. What do you think about it after reading it? Sometimes part of that is, you know, have they conveyed that this is an important area of research? Have they shown why, you know, this research is needed and why it's important and what they're going to be doing? You know, are you convinced that this is something that should be happening, or are you not? And that's also good feedback as well for them. And kind of think, you know, if it's not something that you consider maybe important, is there a different, you know, another area that you would think a bit more that they should have a look at, or you think should be a bit more researched? And you can provide that sort of backup to those comments as well. And then kind of any other sort of general thoughts and suggestions that you've got is always welcome as well, kind of if you feel it doesn't fall into any of those sort of areas. So when I was saying sort of with that final tip about checking your review and kind of have you answered all the questions, it's those questions there of that key detail. Does it cover everything? What's the language like, and what's the proposed research, kind of the importance of it? And it's kind of answering all of those questions. And if you've not been able to kind of answer any of those, then you can kind of also say like why you've not been able to. Is it because they've not put that information in, or is there some other reason as well for it? But those are the sort of tips, I guess, for that plain English summary. So key takeaways from what we've kind of looked at across last session and in this session, and sort of the little differences between all of them. Because I think when we've talked about them, sometimes it's, you know, they all can sound quite similar. You know, you are providing, at the end of the day, your thoughts, your comments to help improve that research. But there's slight differences across the sort of different opportunities. So just a reminder that, you know, the public advisory forums, which are those online meetings with the researcher, and the sole aim and sort of, well, the main aim and focus of that is giving that verbal feedback to help them shape that overall research proposal. The PIER reviews that you can complete are about focusing on that very early stage before they've put their application in, before they've really kind of created that application ideally. And it's looking at those PPIE activities. Are they appropriate? Is the budget appropriate? And are they working with diverse groups in accessible ways, and providing sort of comments on that? And then finally, those plain English summary reviews, it's about that sort of the summary, how it's written, and making sure that it's understandable, and providing sort of written feedback on kind of your thoughts about how understandable it is. I should also say, for providing that written feedback, do not worry about your own grammar or spelling or anything like that. That is never sort of taken into consideration. It's not judged. It's not something for you to worry about at all. We're caring about sort of what your message is, what your comments are, what your thoughts are. We're not looking at, you know, if you've misspelled something, or, you know, if we think a comma should be there, or there's many a comma and it's sort of lists or bullet points. Don't worry about the sort of formatting of your reply. It's just about kind of conveying those comments that you've got, so that that sort of summary can be improved. And so what we'll also do for everybody is I can send, and I know Sally, you put it in the chat as a question, we can send sort of examples of a PIER and plain English, the reviews, kind of what, you know, what it would look like when you get it, and sort of maybe what an example, some like reply somebody has had as well. And we can send that for everybody that's here, but also if you watch this on a recording, and we can send that kind of when everybody gets that information.